right, and we are live, and I don't have my producer with me today, so we're fumbling through this a little bit. We are with Deep Recruiting. My name is Jim Bright, almost 30 years of recruiting experience, and we're here to give you the tactics and strategies in recruiting to help you become more successful. Today, we've got a new special guest, Walter Bright. He is the creator and the first implementer of the D programming language and has implemented compilers for several other languages. He's an expert in all areas of compiler technology, including front ends, optimizers, code generation, interpreter engines, and runtime libraries. Walter regularly writes articles about compilers and programming, is known for engaging and informative presentations, and provides training in compiler development techniques. Most people are surprised to discover that Walter is also the creator of the war game known as Empire, which is still popular today, 30 years after its release. And most importantly, Walter is my older brother, which is how I got him on the podcast. So we're going to talk today about how to identify a quality programmer. As a recruiter, how can we determine what are some tricks we can use to figure out if the programmer we're talking to is an agency caliber candidate, the type of candidate that we are going to be able to collect a fee on. Very important. Everybody, Walter Bright.
Hello.
Hello. So you wrote a compiler back, you wrote a C++ compiler back in the heady days. You grew that to the D programming language, which has its own programming community. I've asked you many times about programming, and you said when you write a compiler, it's like building a race car engine. You know how to build the engine. You may not necessarily know how to drive the car the fastest, but it does help you to understand what makes a good programmer, what doesn't. And when we were talking a little bit about this podcast, you made a point talking about the rules of programming. Could you expand on that a little bit for the recruiters out there to help them understand what you mean by that?
You can pick up lots of books about, how to write good code, and they come with lots of rules. And a beginner will follow the rules because he's told to. A master programmer will follow the rules because he understands the point of the rules. And a guru programmer will break the rules because his understanding transcends the rules. So those are the levels of programming expertise. Go ahead. Lots of things a beginning programmer will do. They will follow the rules to the letter and kind of produce some bad code or code that is kind of a mess because they didn't use good judgment. With every programming rule, you can find a contradictory rule. And so you can use them to the point where your code is a mess and is unreadable and unusable.
You said they can find a contradictory rule. What leads to that contradictory rule? Can you give the recruiters out there who don't code kind of an example of what that means?
It's like investing or something. You can if you read books on investing, you'll find look for this kind of company, and then you'll read another book and you'll find invest in this other kind of company, and they kind of contradict each other. And the same goes for rules of business success. How do you run a successful business? Rules for anything. You'll find that if you read enough about it, they start contradicting each other. And then you have to look at it. You have to sort of transcend it and then evaluate what's going to work best for you. You also see this in books on salesmanship, books on how to make friends. The rules are contradictory. So
I think a lot of the rules in sales are just kind of made up.
Yeah.
By people that were very successful doing it one way And I don't think they recognize that just because it worked for them, it doesn't mean it's everybody. It
Yeah.
worked because their personality matched it. Now,
There's,
with
yeah, there's,
coding's going to be more logical. It's going to be a more precise.
yeah. But the same thing happens like with movies. There's a famous book about how movies should be structured, and a lot of successful movies follow that structure. But once you know what the structure is and you're watching the movie, then you can see that they're following this structure of the book, and it kind of wrecks the movie for you. And then along comes somebody else that breaks all the rules in making movies and makes a hit with it, and it's because he broke all the rules. So
Because the main character that everybody loved dies, or
yeah, and the
he
main
doesn't
character
get the girl
died
in,
2 minutes into the movie.
or he doesn't get the girl in the end. He gets somebody else.
Yeah, and there's the rule that if you have a bunch of people in a horror movie, that there's the main character who's going to live, and then the movie is going to be all about the other characters dying one by one. So then the only interesting thing to the movie comes, having betting beers on the order in which the supporting cast gets killed off.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm reminded when you said about investing money, the Caddyshack movie with Rodney Dangerfield, his investment strategy was everybody's selling, then buy, buy, buy. Everybody's buying, then sell, sell, sell.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how that relates to programming, but it's always struck me as funny. How can a recruiter recognize or quiz a candidate about the rules, how they're following the rules, and whether or not they know what they're doing? What are some questions a recruiter could ask a programmer to try to suss that out of them?
I would think the best way is to do it in kind of a way that doesn't lead them to a particular answer, but ask them to show you a piece of code they've written that they think is very good.
Okay.
And you ask them to explain how it works. And here's a tell. If they can't explain how it works, they're a fraud and it's somebody else's code. And then you sort of do a deep dive and you ask them, explain how it works. What is this doing? And then you ask them, why do you think this code is good?
And I think that's a key question right there. Why do you think this bit of code is good? And if they say, well, it follows all the rules, how do you react to that?
Well, that's a good question. You could ask them what rules they have and why do you think those rules are effective? And then ask them, are there any places where you break the rules and why are you breaking the rules here?
I like that. Why are there any places in your code where you broke the rules and why did you break them? What was the business case or the logical reason for you breaking those rules? Do you think that's a good question?
I think that is a good question.
Okay. What might be a good answer? And I know I'm hitting you here with that prep. What might be a good or bad answer to that question?
Well,
Something to be on the lookout for. Wheels spinning in the head.
If you can't explain why the rules are any good or why the rules he's following matter, that would kind of be an interesting, that would be someone who's more of a beginner programmer. If they can't explain why they're following these rules or what is the purpose of the rules. If you get kind of a gobbledygook answer to it, then they haven't really thought much about it. Another way you can go at it is one thing I've discovered in my own programming is I write a piece of code, I think it's great. 5 years later, I look at that code and I think it's garbage. And so it's kind of a sliding window. as the further back in time I go on my own code, the worse it looks to me. And so when I'm a piece of code I'm working on, even though it's old, I'll often just look at it and then rewrite it to make it simpler and clearer. And that's a continuous process. There's no such thing as achieving perfection. It's always a process of making it better and better. And my ideas on what makes code better have evolved over time due to my seeing other people's code, and I pick up things that I like from that. Problems with, I look at some code I wrote 5 years ago and I have no idea how it works and why I would write such a piece of crap. And very rarely, sometimes I'll look at some old code of mine and go, oh, that's actually pretty good.
But that's rare.
But that's rare. So that's another thing you can ask, their favorite piece of code is just ask them, how would you improve it? How would you make it better, even better than it is?
What's your favorite bit of code and how would you improve it?
Yeah. Well, have them say why it's his favorite and why it's good. And then ask, how might you improve the code? How would it be better? Just kind of see where that goes. And that'll give you an idea if you want to work with this guy.
Yeah. Another good question, I think, from what you said is, how often do you go back and look at your old code from, say, 5 years ago? What's your impression of what you're reading when you look at the code?
Ever look at your code you wrote 5 years ago? Start with that. What is your longest lived piece of code you've written?
Ooh, what's the longest lived piece of code you've ever written?
Yeah, I'm still using code I wrote 40 years ago. Of course, it's been rewritten a number of times, but it's still the same piece of code.
Sounds very object-oriented.
Well, object-oriented is one of those rules techniques where everyone slavishly followed it. It became very fashionable, and everyone did everything object-oriented for a few years, and then it kind of started to lose its luster. People, started discovering the limitations, and it was not a hammer that fit every nail.
Yeah.
And so, I still do object-oriented programming, but I mix it in with other styles of programming. There's no particular style I use.
Something that's interesting, and I'd like to point this out just because this is a podcast about recruiting. You mentioned that object-oriented kind of fell out of favor, and it did. You really don't read about it that much anymore like we did in the late 90s, but you followed it up voluntarily without being asked why. You provided a reason or two why it fell out of favor. And I think that's actually another good sign of somebody who, when you're talking to them about their code, what they wrote, why they wrote, how long has it lasted, why are you continuing to reuse it, and you're quizzing them about the rules, and then they voluntarily go into a bit of an explanation as to why without being prompted, that's going to typically be your better candidate, I think. Not always, but it's a good indicator.
Well, a good programmer can master several styles of programming.
Yeah.
And object-oriented one style.
I placed a gentleman once who had been both a C++ and a Java developer, and he was going from a Java to a C++ job. And I asked, it'd been, I don't know, 5 or 6 years since he'd done any C++, and I asked him, how are you going to make this transition? Because I don't code. And he said, oh, it's easy. It's just a matter of where you put the syntax in the line of code. Really? He says, yeah, it's easy. And sure enough, he nailed the interview and did great and got the offer. So little questions like that uncover a lot about programming and what goes on. You mentioned something interesting when we were in our green room discussion last night about I wanted you to tell a story, and you told a story about somebody who'd written several hundred lines of code that you were able to replace with about 10. Now, I'm doing the bragging for you, so take that off the table. Can you tell us a little bit about that, why and how that happened? And then we'll wrap this thing up.
It was a directory traversal program, and well, it was a library routine that would traverse a directory. And the idea was this this code would traverse a directory for you, and then you were able to plug in actions to do on each file. And the piece of code he wrote was, hundreds of lines long, and I never did figure out how the darn thing worked, and it was very complicated. And he was very proud of it. So I thought, well, why don't I give this a try? And I wrote the equivalent code in about, I don't remember exactly, 10 lines of code, and showed it to him. And he says, well, my has all these extra capabilities. And I says, well, like what? And he showed me a couple, and I says, well, here's how you do it with the code I wrote. And he got so furious with me after a while that he he left. But I wasn't really sad that he left, because I can't work with somebody like that writes complicated code. I've noticed over the years that it's really hard to write simple code. And the result of anybody can write complicated code. Anybody. And a newer programmer will tend to be proud of their complicated code. Look at this edifice I created. And I'm not proud of code like that. To me, the best compliment you could get on a piece of code is somebody to look at and go, well, geez, anybody could have written that.
The best compliment anybody can ever get on code is when somebody else looks at it and says, anybody could have written that, because that means they don't understand.
Oh, it means it's
simplifying it.
Yeah, you'll see that with a good user interface on a program, and you go, oh, that's so simple. Anybody could have done that. And you don't realize how much work it is to make something simple. And, a sign of not a good software engineering is it has a complicated interface. And you see the same thing in like flying airplanes. I used to work at Boeing on airplane design, and I talked with a guy who was in charge of the cockpit. And he said, everything in this cockpit looks simple and obvious. And he said, but everything was paid for in blood. And that was a real eye-opening thing for me, that intuitively obvious interfaces in code is not at all obvious in advance. It's only obvious in retrospect, usually when something bad happens.
You told me a good story about that the landing gear lever actually has a wheel on it.
Yes,
so that when you find it, you're flipping the landing gear. You're not flipping some other random switch. And
That's
that
right.
one was paid for in blood, right?
That's paid for in blood. And the lever to lower the flaps has a little flap on top of it. And that's so that you can put your hand on the lever and you got your hand on the right lever without having to look at it.
Right. Simple code is code.
Yeah. Another interesting thing was they started putting warning horns on an airplane, a warning horn saying like you're too slow or this problem or that, or you got a fire or something like that. And they find that usually on a crisis, multiple horns would go off and the pilots would get all discombobulated about what the horns mean. And they finally hit on the ridiculously obvious solution, which is replace the horn with a voice. And the voice now says, like, if you're too low, the voice comes on and it says, too low, pull up, pull up, pull up. And when you think about that, that's blindingly obvious, but it took decades for aviation to figure this out. And I have a car that has a lot of warning horns, and they got different chimes for different things. And I have no freaking clue what the particular chime means. And so the cars are way behind the aviation industry and having a, easy to use user interface. They're actually, most of them are a mess, but airplanes aren't like that. Airplanes, they really try to learn from any mistakes, pilots hitting the wrong controls. There have been many, many accidents because controls were confusing and then they go around and they find ways to simplify it.
Yeah, the airplane that just crashed in South Korea. I mean, I have no clue, but it looks to me, I know they had their landing gear down on their first attempt. They had their what is thought to be a bird strike. They decide to go around. They come back around. The landing gear is not down. Leads to almost 100% fatality rate accident. And I don't wonder, did they simply forget to put their landing gear down because of other things going on?
That's the only thing I can think of why the gear wasn't down, was they just simply got so caught up in the events that they forgot to lower the landing gear.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't know, but I'm certain that's the way it's going to come out. Well, we've gone here for about 20 minutes. I do want to keep this short for our viewers. We can always do it again. This has been Walter Bright and you can find him at digitalmars.com. Link to that will be in the bio. He's got his own Wikipedia page, so you can look him up there as well. This is Deep Recruiting. If you've got a question or a topic you'd like to see discussed on the show, you can email us at deeprecruiting@teamgtn.com. And we will see you next week. We'll do it every Monday morning at 11 o'clock Central Standard Time. Happy selling, everybody. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.